what I saw happening, and that's, like I say, it's my lifetime experience with seeing this and being close to the arguments all along, is that the inner creationists basically won a public relations battle.
Hmm.
And over time, and by getting into the 1980s and early 90s, theistic evolution began taking a bad rap, and it got caught into the culture wars, like many things in North American evangelicalism. And we're still now trying to, to sort of recapture a more sensible view of science and the Bible.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I've got my friend back on, Dr. John Hilber. We were colleagues back at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary, and now he works at McMaster Divinity School. And so it's great to catch up with him. I wanted to have him on because I get this question all the time, and I thought we need to do at least one episode on it. Having had the conversation now, I think we probably need multiple episodes on it, but it's the question of science and faith, in particular the creation account in Genesis and how that might reconcile with modern evolutionary theory. So we get into that whole conversation, really rich dialogue. It's a long conversation, so if there's parts that you're wanting to jump ahead to, you can use the chapter feature below to get to that part that you're really interested in. But we're hoping that we can just provide some resources for people to help them think through the issue for themselves. That's ultimately the heart behind this video, is just to provide you with resources. If you haven't already, please do make sure that you're subscribed to this channel. We put out new and helpful content like this all the time, on a weekly basis. So you don't want to be missing out on anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. And the last thing I would say is just, if you haven't yet joined our Facebook group, please consider doing that. This is a great space for ongoing dialogue. Sometimes these conversations that I have on the channel are more to open up ongoing conversation. Like, they're not the conversation stopper, but more so the conversation starter. And I think that's the case, especially with an episode like this. There's plenty of areas where we're going to open up dialogue and not just be able to solve every single issue. And so if you want to be part of an ongoing online community of like-minded believers who are seeking to be faithful to Scripture, encourage one another, then please do join our online Facebook community. The link is down in the description. Love to have you join. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our episode. All right, welcome everybody back to the podcast. I'm super excited to have back on my good friend and colleague, Dr. John Hilber. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while. It's a question I'm constantly getting, the question of the relationship between science and the Bible, and particularly science and the creation accounts in Genesis. This is John's area, or one of John's areas of expertise. And so he's really the guy that I've been wanting to have this conversation with. So delighted, John, that you're able to make time for this. I really appreciate it. And I think this is, for many people, it's a very important conversation. So I'm really glad that we're putting this content out there, hopefully just to help people and give them another resource for thinking about how to integrate their faith with science and things like that. So thanks, John, for being on.
Max, thank you for inviting me again. And this is close to my heart. I did my undergrad, as I think I might have mentioned in the last recording, I don't know. I did my undergrad in geology, and then was perplexed at, what to do with the apparent disparity between some readings of Genesis, for example, and the things I was learning. And maybe, at some point I can share a little bit about my own little bio journey on this issue. And I've had it running on the back burner now for almost 50 years in my head. And there's a bit of a morphine or a change in this over the decades. And so I'm glad to help out anybody I can to wrestle through some of this as I have.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe what we can do at the end of this episode too is think a little bit about our own processes and what we would recommend to people as they're wrestling through challenging processes. Like, what kind of questions should you be asking? When is it good to change your view on something? Like, what do you need to have, what kind of evidence do you need to change your view, and all this kind of stuff? That might be interesting to kind of consider. But I thought it would be good to address this question first, which is the question of what's the classical approach of the faithful towards the opening chapters of Genesis. There's a lot of rhetoric that's thrown around about, um, you know, certain views are just trying to accommodate modern science or kind of capitulating to modern science. Almost like in certain quarters, the assumption is that everybody in ancient Israel, early Jews, read Genesis 1 as a literal 6-day creation account. They understood that these two stories were to be read. Genesis 1, 1 through like 2-3 or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and then the next one in beginning in 2-4, that these are to be read as kind of straightforward, almost on the ground historical reporting narratives of what took place, and any other reading of the text is not faithful, and it is modern kind of accommodation. And so I thought it'd be good for us just to begin with a brief overview of pre-modern, so interpreters that are coming way before, like the Renaissance and the um, Enlightenment and all this kind of stuff. Like, what were they thinking about with Genesis 1 and 2? And then talk also about some early evangelicals, because um, I think many American evangelicals have the idea that there's one way evangelicals have read these
Yeah.
accounts. So yeah, let's begin there. Any particular figures that you would point to? I mean, one that I would point to is Philo of Alexandria, if you think that's a good place to start. But if you've got somebody else that you'd like to
Yeah,
begin with,
no,
bring us up.
yeah, I actually, he's on the Jewish side of it,
Yeah,
and it's been a long, long time. I mean, Philo's in an allegory type school. Am I right?
he is, yeah. So I mean, he
Yeah,
reads he reads most of the Bible allegorically, which is to say, not he's not against the literal sense of the text. Like, he thinks that that's important, and in fact, he's got some passages where he rails against the radical allegorizers, those who don't
yeah,
see any connection between the text and history. But what's important for him is, of course, the spiritual meaning of the text. That's where the ultimate meaning lies, and so that's where he tends to go with things. But when he's reading Genesis 1 and 2, he's recognizing things in the text that suggest to him that there's more going on here than just straightforward
yeah,
literal reporting. So he's picking up on those things, like, how is it that we have the sun and the moon? We have the sun showing up on day 4. We kind of need the sun to calculate 24-hour days.
yeah,
Um, he's recognizing that the stuff going on in Genesis 1 and 2, there's some differences, and so he actually reads them as being different accounts, but in a different way than a modern scholar might do. So the Genesis 1 is primarily for him about the construction of the ideas. So when he's thinking about like humanity, the image of God is the idea per se, in a Platonic sense, right? So Plato has this idea of ideas, where we get the English
the
word, right?
ideal.
Of there are these things that exist in the realm of the forms that are primary and the most real thing, and things that exist in material reality are a copy of that.
Yeah,
And so Philo sees kind of that ideal world being cast in some ways in Genesis 1, and the earthly material reality in some ways in Genesis 2 then comes about. So he's got a different set of questions, I guess is what I would say, that he's bringing to Genesis 1 and 2. But he definitely does not read this as a straightforward historical reporting. He sees this as pointing to deeper spiritual truths. Even when we think about like the serpent in the garden, um, he does kind of grant that there is a talking serpent, but he's not really interested in that actual
yeah,
fact, if you will. He's more interested in what the serpent signifies at the spiritual level. And so that's kind of where he goes with all of this stuff. And
yeah,
and why that's so important is that this is a contemporary of Jesus and Paul. He is the one of the most prolific, outside of Josephus, prolific Jewish writers we have from this period. His works were preserved primarily by Christians who found them really important. And this is his allegorical interpretation of Genesis is arguably the earliest commentary, if you will, that we have on Genesis. I mean, we have other Jewish interpretation of Genesis that goes back, but what I mean by commentary is actually kind of like what we would
A
expect, where
formal explanation. Yeah.
correct, where you have more of a formal explanation of what's going on here. So this is one of our earliest, if not the earliest, Jewish commentaries we have on Genesis 1 and 2, and it is manifestly not a literal reading of the text. So I think that's interesting to lay out from the
That's
beginning.
helpful. And Max, I've not read Philo. The much on the Jewish side. I've started mostly on the Christian side with Origen, and then through Augustine and some of the
And
other.
Origen's reading Philo, so
That's
a
yes.
lot of
So
the
Philo leads right into Origen and these guys, and they're
yeah.
doing the same thing. Uh, they recognize that if you approach the text with a hard, sort of wooden, literal hermeneutic, the text deconstructs. It contradicts within itself, and so not just the sun on the fourth day when you have light and darkness, but you have the vegetation existing before the sun. You have the problem of the creation of the animals before or after Adam. The man in Genesis
Right.
1 and Genesis 2, and Augustine. Origen. We're talking circa 200-ish. Augustine circa 400-ish. So this
Mm-hmm.
early hundreds of years of the church, they were early Christians were aware of the difficulties on the one hand of a literal reading,
Mm-hmm.
and that didn't rankle them at all. I mean,
No.
they realized the text was doing something uh, different
Yes.
than that, and so you get some early rabbis after the time of Origen. They talked about, I've read rabbinic commentaries on the serpent,
Mm-hmm.
and the rabbis would debate, is the serpent really a snake or not? And we're talking a few hundred years after the time of Jesus, so these are clearly pre-modern. And this one rabbi is Adam, and he says, obviously, snakes don't talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is going on in the text here?
Mm-hmm.
They had a matter of fact approach about it, and what has become popular nowadays, popularized more recently by a friend of mine, John Walton, that takes Genesis 1 as a sort of temple construction dedication text. Well, and he wouldn't claim it's new to him, but his view goes back to the early rabbis who read Genesis 1 and saw the tabernacle and the construction of the temple there
Mm-hmm.
in Genesis chapter 1. So some of these readings that are sort of criticized today as being crazy do go back to people who were clearly pre-scientific. In fact, Augustine has some very nasty things to say about uh, fellow Christians who didn't believe in a round spherical Earth.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few Christians who were still hanging on to a flat Earth at that time, and he lamented the damage that they did to the gospel by hanging on to antiquated scientific
Oh,
models that that made Christians look stupid.
yeah.
And he has, I won't take the time to read, the passage, but he has some pretty, let's just say, unkind things to say,
Yeah.
about this because of the damage that it did to the gospel and
Yes.
the
Yes.
credibility of Christianity. But Augustine was the big one who launched what we'll talk more about, the notion of accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
That God lowers himself. He condescends to the understanding, the capacities of finite humans, and so God has to speak in language that doesn't necessarily answer questions that we would have about origins, but yeah, it has a message that conveys to the unlearned person. And even Augustine and Origen, they're North African. That's a whole, as you know, Max, that's a whole huge, important, influential
Mm-hmm.
uh, tradition within early Christianity So many within that whole North African church were followers of Augustine and went the same way as Origen in that regard. In the Eastern Mediterranean, there are the Eastern fathers, and tended to read the text a little more, what we might say, literally. That's maybe not fair. So they were worried about some of the allegorical excesses of people like Origen.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they read the Genesis text, they often did tend to think of it as 7 normal days, unlike Augustine and the North African tradition that took it as almost instantaneous creation
Right, because his
that's
concern,
spelled
it's
out.
important to highlight this too with Augustine, and this is something that I would underscore for everybody listening and watching. In all these instances, we have people coming to the text asking specific questions of the text that are, it's also shaping. So Philo is asking a certain set of questions of the text.
Mm-hmm.
Augustine's big question wasn't really scientific per se, it was the
It's
relationship between
theological.
creation and the beginning of time.
Yeah.
That was the big puzzle he was trying to solve. And so, yeah, when John talks about this instantaneous burst of creation, that was Augustine trying to make sense of the relationship between eternity and time,
Yeah.
because that for him was the most important question that he was trying to solve with the whole
Yeah.
Genesis conversation.
Yeah. So he's wrestling with, were the angels created at the time of light? And, who's observing all this that's happening? And, because he's wrestling with the people who held to some unorthodox views of the relationship between God and creation. So the early church, went with non-literal readings, and as mentioning, even one of the church fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, he saw this sort of not necessarily chronological unfolding, but a logical unfolding in creation, and was one of the founding heads of this line of thinking of differentiation and then adornment in creation, which eventually lends itself to the pretty much consensus view now among interpreters that Genesis 1 to 3 gives the structure of creation, and Genesis 4 through 6 gives the filling of those things. And we can talk about some of the details of that later. That was one of the more instrumental insights that led me away from this sort of concordant scientific kind of reading of Genesis. But then you move in through the medieval church, and Augustine was so influential that his view was never really cast aside. Everybody pretty much said that's a plausible, viable option. To read the text in this more theological way, not a scientific, chronological, concordant way. There were some medieval theologians who still held very tightly to Augustine and didn't think we could say anything about the nature of the days, even though the majority probably just by default thought, there's 7 24, or 6 24-hour periods. They weren't fussed about that because nothing challenged their thinking in terms of the age of the earth at that point. And so they read it in a straightforward manner. But a very vocal minority, an important minority of primary theologians in the medieval church, didn't think that the days were to be read literally, and they followed Augustine on that. Really, all the way up through the time of Calvin and Luther, just took it for granted, that this was the way to read it. But there's still this minority voice, though. One really important thinker, argued by some to be the greatest mind in England at the time, living at the late 1400s. So he's still pre-scientific and peaking out about 1500. John Colet, Colet, and he argued in a some letters exchanged with another person that was asking these kinds of questions. He argued very adamantly that that these were sort of poetic days, and that God's accommodation was not giving a sort of structured day by day blow of it, but These are literary days, not literal days. And so he really anticipated by hundreds of years what is, one of the dominant interpretive models of even evangelicals nowadays is to read the text as a sort of quasi-poetic, treatise, and that God accommodated himself to the 7 days in order for people to understand. He's talking to Jewish people. He's trying to establish, a 6 day plus one work week. And so there's a theological thrust there behind structuring the days. Uh, Luther is a good illustration of how we can get into trouble by reading our assumptions. Luther read, for example, um, the waters above the earth, and he's working with this Aristotelian model of the cosmos at that point. That that had these layers, above the earth, these spheres. In which the clouds, the stars were in a sphere, the planets are in spheres, and he thought that the waters above the earth were the layers of ice between the spheres that were necessary to keep the spheres from heating up to the melting point. I mean, at that point they were starting. What would become modern cosmology was beginning to emerge, and they were doing mathematical calculations on friction. And Luther, being the good educated university scholar that he was, knew the physical problems of Aristotelian model. So he said, well, easy solution. The waters above are the layers of ice that kept the spheres cool, as we know is necessary in the physics of things. So you see all the way from early church, Augustine, all the way up through Luther, and Calvin was saying, trying to talk about the waters again. He thought they were clouds. He said, but the details, if we want to get answers to cosmology, let's go to the astronomers, because the Bible's not trying to address that. Yeah. So all the way from early church through these early influential reformers, they're integrating philosophy. They're integrating the science as they knew it. They're trying to think holistically about reading the text, not just in the biblical context, but in the context of everything that we know. And so it's really in the early age of science, getting into the 1700s, where the trouble begins, when these scientists begin realizing that the earth is older than what it might be interpreted as on a certain kind of reading of Genesis. And at the same time, as science was emerging, there was this sense that if you wanted to say something important, it had to have scientific implications and reference and relevance. And so biblical scholars then began trying to read the Bible in this sort of what we call concordant manner. By concordant, I mean that the wording of the text somehow lines up with what we know going on in science. There was no interest in that, up until the early age of science. And so this day-age theory emerges fairly early on in the age of science, to say, well, these days must be long periods of time, because they're still trying to read a chronology out of Genesis 1 and to make sense of that, so that by the 1800s, pretty much every pastor and theologian, we didn't have liberalism yet. We had, some people who were starting to venture off, the deep end, or off the cliff, actually, in terms of rationalism. But for the most part, there was still a unified voice in the church among pastors and theologians, and most of them were day-age theorists. They had given up on a young Earth, decades, and in some cases by a couple of centuries in some traditions. And so they were still trying to read the text, though, in this concordant manner with science. Some of the early, you mentioned early evangelical. If you want to think of the evangelicals emerging in the 20th century, let's say late 1800s, early 20th century, in response to people who are taking a more rationalist approach to the faith. The great Princetonians, from the days of Princeton, Yeah, the
You have to
old.
put great in quotes because depending on who you ask, these are either the best people or the worst
Yeah,
people to
yeah,
ever.
exactly. But I think that these were pretty smart.
Yeah, they were. They
These were
were.
the greatest minds that Christianity had on the North American continent. At least the British had their own brilliant writers, and people like the Hodges, yeah, uh, B.B. Warfield
Warfield.
is an important one. J. Gresham Machen, Warfield and Hodge. Now Hodge didn't like evolution, but he didn't have a problem with it. He was in fact, he may have been a gap theorist. I'm trying to remember now whether he's day age or gap theory. That gap theory also emerged in the late 1800s,
He wrote
where
like he wrote an article. I think it was like 3 years after Origin of Species came out, and he says at the end of it something like Darwinism is atheism, and people have picked up on that and quoted that. But if you read it more carefully,
yeah,
he also wants to distinguish between what he's meaning by Darwinism there is basically what we would call naturalism.
yeah, dealing God out of the picture completely.
Correct,
Yeah,
correct. Which he sees as a potential implication of Darwinian evolution, but he doesn't seem completely closed off to modern scientific explanations. And then Warfield's much more open. He's kind of an agnostic in some ways.
yeah,
And because Hodge was his mentor, I don't think he was going to champion it or anything, but he's certainly very open to it. And if you look at the way these guys did theology, they looked at theology as a kind of scientific practice of gathering data, organizing data, and arranging it in a systematic theology. So they were very scientific in their approach
yeah.
to theology. Yeah, their way of doing theology is almost unimaginable apart from their ideas of like kind of modern scientific method.
Yeah, yeah. So Warfield, even, I mean, uh, he probably was not um, an evolutionist in a scientific sense, but had no problem with the old Earth, and he had no problem theologically with evolution as such, because there was theistic evolution. God uses that as a process.
Mm-hmm.
It's really quite important, and this brings it up into my living memory. So I'm speaking as one of experience who was alive at the time this was playing out. That in the 1960s is when this new young Earth movement really came into being. That people had various old Earth models all through the 20th century, and it was Wickham and John Wickham and Henry Morris and some others who took up a model by a scholar by the name of Price, who was a Seventh Day Adventist, that the Earth had to be young, and this flood geology model that can explain all the rock strata. That really didn't come into popular knowledge and acceptance until beginning circa 1960.
Hmm.
And when I became a Christian and was starting to launch into these things, I date myself now. In 1973, I graduated from high school. At that time, theistic evolution was pretty much one of the common views held by card-carrying, conservative evangelicals. Not all, but I mean, it was one of the views. It was a viable option that I, as a young Christian, I sort of graduated from high school and I started looking into these things, and I could choose between young Earth creationism or theistic evolution. There were faithful ways of reading the text. No litmus tests, no problem with that. And what I saw happening, and that's, like I say, it's my lifetime experience with seeing this and being close to the arguments all along, is that the young Earth creationists basically won a public relations battle.
Hmm.
And over time, and by getting into the 1980s and early 90s, theistic evolution began taking a bad rap, and it got caught into the culture wars, like many things in North American evangelicalism. And we're still now trying to sort of recapture a more sensible view
Yeah.
of science in the Bible. But I think it's really important for viewers here to understand that that historically speaking, the view that I hold is mainstream for pretty much church history,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
especially in the last 150 years.
Well, I think the one other thing I would just point out for our listeners and our viewers is I think the big difference between, let's say, modern biblical scholarship approach to Genesis 1 and 2 and the ancient one, they're recognizing a lot of the same things in the text, but their interests are different. So,
Mhm.
like, modern scholars come along and they say, oh, we have these kind of discordant accounts. The language for God is a little bit different. There seems to be different perspectives. These seem to be actually two different sources, which is kind of a consensus view among modern scholars. Well, that wasn't really an interest for ancient interpreters. They weren't doing source criticism per se because they had different assumptions, right? They're assuming it's all inspired, it's all here, but they're noticing many of the same things that modern scholars point to for pointing out these different things. So there's like different interests that people are bringing to the text, but the idea that these things are just now being seen and discovered is totally fallacious. Like they've people have always recognized them. It's just about how you've handled them, and how you handle them has always been a combination of faith presuppositions
Mhm.
and other assumptions about what are the important questions on the table. Like they weren't dealing with the question of theistic evolution or evolution in that time period because that wasn't on the table.
Right,
But
right.
you darn well better know, like, if it was, they would have been dealing with it.
Yeah.
So it's also, I mean, we can come back to this at the end, but people have to deal with the information that they have available to them at the time. But there's a lot we can learn from this process of how other ancient interpreters are handling the text. It's this idea that just, yeah, everyone was reading it in a straightforward literal way is just not, it's not correct.
Mhm.
And if we pay attention to what they're doing, it actually, I think, opens up a lot of space for asking better questions of the text today than maybe some of us were encouraged to ask in church.
Even the idea, Max, this maybe moves on to another topic that we had talked about wanting to discuss. This whole business about literal reading and
Yeah.
what makes sense in terms of linguistics, how we understand language actually works in operation. It's not only is it false that the church, the faithful church, read the Bible, read Genesis 1 literally all the way, through church history. That's false. It's also false, just from a purely linguistic viewpoint, that literal interpretation is the default.
Yeah.
I was taught, in seminary, you read the Bible literally unless the literal sense makes nonsense, or no sense or whatever. And that was kind of a mantra that I had. And that's just not right.
Yeah.
Linguists know that when we get stimulus, or oral stimulus, or reading and visual stimulus, we our brain immediately activates. If you could put the electrodes on the brain to see where it lights up and everything, they've actually done this. The brain sort of lights up and explodes with possibilities, and then as a person grabs the context, uh, the brain is like it shuts down, and the light appears in certain specific areas.
Hmm.
And what that goes along with is the more correct idea that the brain, when we as human beings try to maximize the information, the significance of the information that we're taking in through our senses, and in an optimal sort of way, so that the the reason that poetry, for example, is so important and is the dominant mode of God speaking, in the Old Testament, is that poetry carries more punch with each package. And so, along with that, the human brain actually will default to a metaphorical interpretation rather than a literal interpretation, if the metaphorical interpretation makes any sense.
Hmm.
Why? Because there's more relevant information contained in that word sense than a straightforward literal sort of dictionary reading. So quite the contrary, normal just human communication will try to maximize the information to be gained. And if you're a communicator and you're speaking or writing, you want to do so optimally so that you can, in a concise way, uh, package what you want to convey. So unlike, I mean, one of my errors, I was ramble on at times, this bad communication technique, because we want to be optimal
Right.
in what we're saying.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No,
got to
I
let
think that's
go of
really
literal.
helpful. Yes. So let's think about the kind of interpretive principles, linguistic principles that would be natural, or we should maybe be bringing to a text like Genesis 1, say. Um, we have to be, when we're thinking about the kind of communication that would be taking place here, part of what we have to think about is, well, what were the frameworks in place for people? Like, what was God trying to communicate to people? How would we know that?
Mm-hmm.
Because we might open up the beginning of the Bible and think, from our perspective, wouldn't the most logical thing do, if God was going to tell and communicate the origin story of the cosmos, wouldn't the most logical thing to do would be to lay out kind of in a scientific manner how God did that? But is that what an ancient Israelite would have expected? Is that what somebody living in any of the ancient Near Eastern cultures would have expected? We can say pretty definitively no. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's just, maybe we could spend a few minutes just kind of helping people get a little bit of a glimpse of what are the kind of questions that ancient peoples had about creations, and what was really even the purpose of creation stories, so that what could we plausibly assume an ancient Israelite would be expecting to hear, just even before they heard the text of Genesis 1 about the creation? What kind of questions would they be expecting answers to?
Yeah, that's important observations and question marks. There was no real quote what we call scientific thinking before the Greeks, in like the 5th century in Greece. But if you go to the world of ancient Israel, they were they there's I've read a lot of ancient Near Eastern texts. It's kind of aside after leaving geology, that's kind of the area where I like to spend my time. There's not a shred of evidence that any people in the ancient world of the Near East, or anyone prior to a few Greek philosophers, 5th century, had any interest in what we would regard as sort of scientific explanations of what makes the world operate, how does it function. They were interested in the relationship. They assumed the world of the gods, for non-Israelites, a polytheistic world of many gods, and they were very interested in the relationship between the gods and the created order, and themselves in the created order. And they were agriculturalists, so they were very concerned about what makes my crops grow, what makes my flocks.
Where's the water coming from?
That's
Yeah.
exactly, where's the water, where's the sunshine. uh, how do I know when to plant, the rhythm of the seasons? How do I know when to plant seed? How do I know that when I throw a certain seed in the ground, let's say it's barley, that I'm going to get barley? How do I know that, we're not going to get, foxes from my goats? Yeah, I mean, those are quasi-scientific questions, actually. I mean, they are good questions of biology, and they knew from experience the regularity of things, but they wanted to know sort of why, what undergirded the regularity that gave them reason for trust or praise. And so all of the ancient Near Easterners were concerned, and there are many creation accounts outside of Genesis that exist even, a millennium before,
Right. Much earlier
much
than, yeah.
earlier than
Yep.
the account in the Bible. And they are all interested in these same sorts of questions. and we can read them. There are some of these texts are not as well known as some of the others. There's the great creation account that involves Marduk that that people are most familiar with, where Marduk goes into combat with the waters, the chaotic waters of,
Tiamat.
the Tiamat, the ocean, and he slaughters this chaos goddess and cuts her in half, puts half of her waters above, half of her waters are below. Still, the place where that he brings the earth then.
This is the
From
Babylonian
the
creation
Babylonian
account,
yeah,
Enuma Elish, which
yep, went on high.
many scholars went on high, and that's also I think important to point out. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. That's kind of like a heading, sort of like went on high, in a sense that it's setting up, right? Like
It is.
the story of how this emerges. It's a lot of these stories don't begin with the question of like nothingness into something, but rather they're sort of primordial chaos or
The
something.
soup.
Soup, yes.
The soup is there.
And then out of that, right, emerges the order. And the question is, who's the God that brings the order to the whole thing? That's the high God, right? That's the God that's worthy of worship or whatever.
Well, and the fundamental question is that in all of the narration and creation accounts, except for Genesis 1, the first thing to come out of the soup are the gods. And so the gods emerge in these families, and then one of them kind of gets is powerful enough to bring order to everything else and to structure the universe as we and the ancient Near Easterners experience it. But in addition to the went on high, we actually have a couple of accounts that are not well known. Babylonian accounts again that actually use the same word in the beginning, and those are written in the language called Akkadian, which is a sister language to, as you know, Max, to biblical Hebrew, so that it would be like Dutch and German. And so you can see basically the same words there as you see in the biblical account. If you can read Hebrew, you recognize the words in the Akkadian account, and they start out in the beginning. This is just the way you tell, the narrative, because we want to know. This goes back to the origin. Who do I trust? Why should I, do what I do? And what's my relationship to all of this? And the Egyptians, the same as the Babylonians, they had their accounts open up with the waters of chaos. There's darkness. There's in some of the accounts there's the wind, blowing. They have a word for chaos. They call it a chaotic mess, and so the accounts have very similar language and imagery as we see in Genesis chapter 1. Invariably, there's a separation that takes place, as order and structure is created. The important difference that the Israelite learns is that in their faith, there's the one God who didn't come out of the waters. His spirit was hovering over the waters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it doesn't. The waters which are threatening, even elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, God battles the sea monster. In Genesis 1, they're so non-threatening. God just speaks. There's the battle motif, which you find in some of the Isaiah and then in some of the Psalms, is so toned down in Genesis 1. It's hard to not think it's kind of trying to make a theological point about the sovereignty of Israel's God vis-a-vis these other things. Like even the monsters of the sea, be fruitful and multiply.
God just creates them as things in the ocean.
Yeah. So okay, good. So there's a lot of differences, different things going on here that we just want to pay attention to, because the question of what is Genesis trying to address, maybe this gets to your point about divine accommodation. You maybe want to say a couple things about this. So people will point to these accounts and say, well, look, this is presupposing an ancient Near Eastern cosmology. It's not a scientific account. And I would say, yeah, exactly. Yep. But some people actually struggle with that, because either from a skeptical standpoint, they might use that as evidence to say, oh, look how primitive this Bible is. where others might really struggle with that and say, oh my, the Bible has scientific inaccuracies, right? Both of us would say, no, it's presupposing the world of the audience. It's communicating to the audience in the framework and a cultural framework that the audience would understand. And that comes back to this idea of divine accommodation. So how do you see that at work in Genesis?
Yeah. So I think it's useful to think about the Bible as a whole and ask where anywhere in the Bible do we get instructed about scientific matters. This is an assumption that we bring to the text because we are modern. The irony is that it's the we talk about the pre-modern and the modernists, and the modernists are the ones who have destroyed the biblical text. But the irony is that it's the modernist scientific presuppositions that make us have expectations that the Bible needs to address those
Mm-hmm.
scientific questions. And that's why I pointed it out earlier that it was, in the age of science that for some reason theologians started thinking like they had to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody worried about that, before the time. And let's take something less controversial like the language of psychology in the Old Testament. We we think, feel, and make decisions with the heart. Well, we have that as a metaphor today. Well, the problem is that for us it's metaphor, but for them it wasn't. Why? Because when they felt fear or they felt
You
love,
feel it in your
passion,
gut.
it's in your chest. Well, we know it's an adrenaline rush, and it does affect you physiologically. And so they made a connection between the emotional side and these deep internal organs. And the Egyptians, for example, when they embalmed people, they knew that the heart was important, and they put it in a special jar. When they embalm, what did they do with the brain? They scraped it out and threw it in the garbage can because to them was this gray matter. They didn't know what to do with it, and so there's no indication of the sense of a brain, and they weren't worried about that. They were explaining sort of at just the phenomena of what they experienced. That's how they wrote. And so God is accommodating the sort of phenomenological worldview that was sort of reduced to just describing what you can see and perceive, such as the sun rising, and we can talk about that in a minute as we get into one of my pet models, which is relevance theory. What kind of language did they use to describe what they experienced? And they did that without really concern for the hows and the whys.
Mm-hmm.
And so they weren't explaining, they weren't trying to explain anything in terms of the human physiology about emotions and such, nor were they trying to do that about creation.
Yeah.
They observed, and they used what they observed to describe they described what they observed, and then wrote accounts that answered other kinds of questions that pertain to the gods. Who are we? How are we related to the gods? How are we?
Right.
Again, issues of agriculture were their big concern, or which I think the early rabbis were correct, and John Walton is, I think, largely correct, and most of the Old Testament scholars that I hang out with were all, card-carrying inerrantists. We believe the Bible is true and whatever it affirms is true. We're all on the same page as this, that Genesis 1 is sort of describing this construction of a cosmic temple. That God is creating a world for his creatures to inhabit that is also a place for him ultimately to inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
He's outside of it as the creator, but yet, we know that he takes his place in the tabernacle and the temple, and ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ, the
Yeah, I
God
mean, if you want
man.
to make a kind of a theological connection that you find in early patristics, right? The image of God is actually made. So the image of the human being, the image of God, is actually made as from the prototype of Jesus, who will become the incarnate Son, right? And if that image is the image in the temple,
Mm-hmm.
that's also God and humanity together, which is the image, in the cosmic temple. And yeah, so I'm totally on board with that. It makes good sense to me. And I've been trying to think about this more recently, about how to communicate this at a more popular level, because I've been doing more of this online stuff, and
Yeah.
I get a lot of pushback, both from maybe more conservative Christians on one hand, and many atheists and skeptics on the other hand. And a constant complaint I hear from both sides really comes down to the same fundamental premises about what the Bible is. So I think a lot of people just have this idea that if the Bible is a divine holy book, it has to communicate the way I think a divine holy book must
Yeah.
communicate, which is to say
Yeah.
that um, it's got it's got to be scientifically accurate on all these things, um, without asking the question, like, but is that even what the Bible claims to be doing, or is setting out to do? So it's very interesting to me. But I think when we talk about like inerrancy, right? What you're saying here is that you're making a judgment about what the communicative intentions of the Bible are, kind of at the grand level, and saying that's what that's what Scripture is trying to do for us. That's what the accounts are trying to communicate to us. um, the medium in which it does it, of course, presupposes the cultural framework that surrounds it. Because how else could you communicate to human beings? How else could you communicate in language? Like, if God wanted to communicate with ancient Israelites, why would we expect God to communicate to ancient Israelites as he would to 21st century Americans?
Right.
Right? Like, I
Exactly.
have I have no problem saying, if God were to choose, if God chose a different plan and God were to choose to write the Bible today, it would look very different. I have no problem saying that.
Yeah. I agree.
But
Yeah.
God didn't. This is how God chose to communicate. God
Yeah.
chose to work in this particular way. And so there's nothing incoherent about the Christian tradition's claim of inspiration or even inerrancy, unless our argument is that um, what the text is trying to communicate is, you know, a certain kind of modern scientific precision, which is not in any way what the claim is, right? The biblical claim of inspiration is actually, I think, more complicated, but also more beautiful than a lot of moderns have an appetite for entertaining, which is that it's both fully the divine word of God and fully human word, and those two things are not, they don't erase each other, but they also, how you navigate that is complicated, because it's a bit of a mystery. But what we're thinking about here is not, we're not trying to, I don't know how to say it. It's not like we're trying to, play fast and loose with the text on the one hand, or just answer the questions of skeptics on the other, and we're just special pleading. We're not special pleading. We're trying to be faithful to the long Jewish and Christian tradition, or even traditions of reading the Bible. And even in our own context, where we do take historical context very seriously as modern trained biblical scholars, we're saying to people, hey, with all the training and the research we've done, this text is manifestly not about answering modern scientific questions. It just isn't.
Yeah.
Um, so,
But and it brings us back to the question about how to just step outside of biblical studies for a minute and just talk about linguistics and human communication models. And I already mentioned this notion of optimizing, language. For the listener, reader, you want to maximize the benefit, the cognitive benefit from what you can get. From the standpoint of the author or speaker, they want to do so in an optimal way. And back to something you said, if God had tried to communicate scientific concepts to the ancient audience, this whole thing would be Genesis chapter 1. And even today, I mean, think of what we don't understand of the cosmos, and there are probably categories mathematical equations that haven't been, sort of resolved yet.
Think about the
The,
major paradigm shifts we've had in science over the last couple of centuries.
yes,
Let's just assume the Earth lasts in this state for another 2,000 years. Does anyone honestly believe the scientific discussion is going to be the same today as it
yeah,
will be in 2,000 years? So, are
yeah,
we expecting that the God of the universe wrote this book for us so that we can have perfect scientific knowledge of the world? If that's the claim, then we have a real problem, because that's not the book we have. But that's never been the claim.
yeah,
So,
yeah. That's right.
yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to use an illustration. So let me say something about relevance theory, if I can. Relevance theory builds off of the notion that I just described, that listeners want to maximize the cognitive benefit, and speakers want to speak in an optimal way. And there's a sort of handshake that we have. So, like in my family, I've mentioned already that I tend to do rabbit trails or whatever, and my students know this as well. But in my family, my wife and daughter have permission just to do this. Now that doesn't mean time out. Uh,
Go to
you
your
know,
room.
now in a basketball or football game, or basketball game, put that in that context. T means time out. In my family, that means dad, too much information. T for too much information. So we try to be, if we're good communicators, we try to be optimal. And part of the optimization comes from knowing your audience, knowing what assumptions are in their brains that you can count on in the communication process. Max, when you and I talk to our colleagues at an academic meeting, we use language and take shortcuts all the time that we would never do in a conversation in a adult Bible study class at church. And even there, we take shortcuts that we would never use in in a first grade Sunday school class. So this is back to this notion of accommodation, and and also the issue of optimizing the language that we use to pack in as much as we can communicate, uh, based on the assumptions that we are connecting between ourselves, our brains, and the assumptions that we know are in the mind of the audience. So let's use a non-biblical example completely, and I'm going to try to just cut through the theory and just get to some illustrations. And because we use relevance theory every day in our communication, whether we realize it or not. All right, I make the statement: there's a tree. Okay, let's play with some different contexts. We are out in a field on a hot day, and I say to you, Max, there's a tree. What comes to mind?
Yeah.
The sun's beating down. Let's go get some shade.
Yeah. In fact, you're making an indicative statement, but it could even be taken as a kind of suggestive command. Let's uh,
Exactly.
let's stop and rest.
Yes. So what we do with our speech, it's not always just conveying information. We're also trying to motivate. We're trying to warn, all kinds of things. Now let's change the context. We're in the desert, and our water skins are getting empty. And I say, Max, there's a tree. Now, where there are trees, there is an oasis and water. So now I'm tapping into a different assumption in your mind. Now, let's say we're in the Arctic, completely opposite context. It can't be the Arctic, there would be no trees. Subarctic. And the sun's going down, it's getting cold, and we're going to die without heat. And I say, there's a tree. Now, two things. One, it's warmer. Tell the child if they're lost in the woods, hug a tree. A, because they stay in one place, it can be found. B, because it's warmer. But probably, I'm thinking, no, you can, cut off a limb. We can make a fire, or construct better shelter for ourselves or something. There are other assumptions that are coming into play. All I've done, Max, is change the context. And the same words, look them up in the dictionary. There is tree. Look them up in the dictionary. It's not going to help you know what I'm communicating.
Yeah. And
So,
if you were an alien that came down from outer space and we handed you a dictionary and you looked up tree and we plopped you in these different contexts, you would have no idea what John is talking about, what John's actually trying to do, because nothing about the definition of tree is going to give you the answer to those questions. You need the cultural framework or encyclopedia to get what he's trying to communicate in all of those instances.
Exactly right. Now let's pick an example where there might be some erroneous assumptions in the mind of the listeners. You go into a grocery store and you ask the grocery clerk, where are the tomatoes? Well, where do we find tomatoes? Well, they're over there with the lettuce and the cabbage and the carrots and the celery with the other vegetables, right? Well, am I affirming in that statement that a tomato is a vegetable? Well, I might be, if I'm not educated in my, botanical science, I might actually believe that tomatoes are vegetables.
What's funny about that is my dad's a produce guy, so obviously I know better.
Oh, yeah.
But when you have people making the same mistake for so long, it becomes the new thing.
Yeah.
I almost think that's what happened to the tomato. So many people assumed it was a vegetable. If you look it up now on the dictionary or I bet you they list it now as both. I would
They
not be
might.
surprised. It's kind of like the statement, it begs the question. Everyone didn't realize that was like a logical fallacy. So if they want to say it raises the question, they use the statement, it begs the question.
Mm-hmm.
And people have done that so much now in the English language. That's the dominant use of that term now. Drives me crazy, but it's funny how like errors, bad assumptions that get replicated enough actually change the way things mean.
But we're not going to go run into the grocery to your dad and say, "You
No.
liar! You misled me. Tomatoes are supposed to be in with the apples and bananas and the other fruit because it's a fruit." No, because we know that your father is accommodating our culinary interests and the need to organize the information in a way that's more functional and useful. Now, let's change the setting again. Now we paid our admission into the Botanical Museum. We're walking through the Botanical Museum and we see tomatoes in the same room with the other vegetables. Now we're going to go to the curator of the museum and we've got a legitimate complaint. So I like to use that because when we go to the Bible and expect it to speak to botanical interests, I mean, in the technical sense, rather than culinary interests or other theological interests, let's say, we're making a wrong interpretive move. And it all plays off of what assumptions are in the mind of the author and the audience, and what assumptions is the text, the wording of the text, trying to trigger. And for the ancient audience, God was not trying to trigger scientific assumptions with the language that he used. And so even people who are old earth advocates, I respect Reasons to Believe is an apologetic organization that does really good science. And they hold to old earth, but they're still trying to find a concord between Genesis and science, so that when God says let there be light, that's got to be the Big Bang, for example. Mm-hmm. And my challenge to them is that they're doing great science. They really are, but they're not doing good biblical interpretation when they think that hidden in the words of the Bible, somehow that language is supposed to be triggering modern scientific. Well, modern by what standard? 20th century science, 21st century science, 23rd century science. What standard of science is supposed to be activated by these Bronze Age words? That's getting me going. I love, and it is so liberating, Max. When the day came in my life when I finally let go of trying to find scientific concord with the Bible.
Yeah.
When I made that interpretive release, And it was a couple of articles written by, an author in Westminster Theological Journal, which is a, impeccable credentials, Westminster Theological Journal. And there was Davis Young. He was a geologist. He's still alive. He retired now at Calvin University, Calvin College then, writing 2 articles in succession in Westminster that convinced me as a young pastor that I didn't have to read Genesis in a concordant way.
Yeah.
I could read it in the grocery store versus reading it in the botanical garden.
Mm.
Let's take a look now at a biblical example, but one that doesn't do with cosmology. So we're still not on this hot button topic, but one that we're all going to agree on. Take animal sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
In the ancient Near East, everybody knew, it was their assumption, that you had to feed the gods. In fact, there's a famous book on Mesopotamian, ancient Babylonian civilization. In the chapter on religion, is titled by Oppenheim, "The Care and Feeding of the Gods," because that was the way they thought about their worship. They brought their offerings in to take care of the gods. So that assumption is there, and now God introduces sacrifice for Israel, and actually uses language, fragrant aroma, a word for food.
Right.
You pour out the libation, the wine, that's drink. The imagery just shouts at us, food. So you have the danger there of the assumption that God actually needed the food.
Right.
Now, when we look at what sacrifice does theologically, there are assumptions about atonement. Yeah, let's bring that in. There are assumptions about making God, pleased with our sacrifices. Yeah, let's bring that assumption in. How about feeding God? We better not bring that assumption in. And in fact, if we do, then we get admonished in Psalm 50, God saying, look, I don't need your offerings. If I was hungry, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. So dangerous is the potential of bringing in this wrong assumption that there are places where, the psalmists and the prophets are careful to correct Israel when they pull in the wrong assumption. Mm. And in linguistic terms, relevance theory terms, that's called implicating an assumption into the meaning of the conversation that you are having. So we have to be very careful about what assumptions that might be implicit in the background. They're implicit in the culture. So all the things we know about trees, water, shade, shelter or fuel. Those are all assumptions, but depending on context, you are implicating some assumptions and not others. Mm-hmm. Tomatoes in the grocery store. You're implicating some assumptions about tomatoes. They do go with vegetables in a salad, but not other assumptions, i.e. it's a fruit. Sacrifice. We're implicating pleasing and honoring God with our sacrifice, but we are not implicating what could be an implicit assumption that it actually gives God nutrition. Mm-hmm. So when we get to the creation text and the cosmology text, we have to apply the same hermeneutic that we use in all these non-biblical and the biblical illustration. Are we trying to implicate anything to do with scientific explanations of cause and effect? And I say no.
Yeah.
And the minute that we try to implicate into the language of the text some of these assumptions, we get into trouble. Instead, we need to implicate other assumptions about what's the supernatural realm like? Who are the gods or God? Who are these other supernatural beings who aren't gods? Are they really the sun and the moon and the stars, or are those just created objects? Do we fear the sea because it's this cosmic chaos monster, or is it under God's control? Can we rely on the seasons? or are we at the mercy of these fickle gods that live in Mesopotamia, who may or may not want to bring the change of the season that brings the rains, that feeds our crops and gives water to our animals? Or do we trust in Yahweh, our God, who has created all these things?
Even the
Those,
choice of the number 7, right? I mean, that's trying to make a point about structure and order. The choice
yes,
of that number 7, obviously it fits in with the Sabbath cycle, and that gets taken up explicitly elsewhere in the Pentateuch to explain why we rest on the Sabbath. But if you're trying to write a creation account to speak about order as well, the choice of 7, I mean, it seems very obvious
yeah.
in an ancient Near Eastern context, right? Everybody loves the number 7.
Can I read one footnote?
Yeah, go for it.
And I've just got a list here of the sevens. Okay. I quote first Richard Averbeck, who's a friend of mine. He just retired, professor of Old Testament and Semitics at Trinity Evangelical. Uh, he's got an unpublished article that I got from him where he lists a few of them. A 6+1 pattern is utilized in Exodus 24 and Job and Proverbs, just a pure literary pattern where you get this 7 pattern. There's 7-day periods surround temple construction and dedication. 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 7. It took 7 years to build the temple. 7 petitions dedicate the temple at this time. The tabernacle instructions are given in groups of 7. Each set of 7 instructions begins with a formula. Then, I give you the verses. A 7-day ritual occurs for the Israelites' priestly ordination. 7-day rituals dedicate the temple in Ezekiel's vision. A 7-day temple dedication sets apart a temple in Mesopotamia as well. It's not just the Old Testament Israel. In Mesopotamia, Baal. How many days does it take Baal to build his temple? I'll give you one guess. 7 days for Baal. This is one of my favorites. In the Ugaritic legend of Kirtu, Kirtu goes on an expedition to get a wife. How many days does it take to get a good wife? 7, of course. There's the duration of Job's friends' lamentation. 7 days. Samuel's wedding feast. 7 days. This hero, another non-Israelite legend about distribution of donations. There are 7 lamentation rites in that. Jericho falls in 7 days with 7 trumpets when they go around the city 7 times. The number 7 is perfect for the refinement of gold. The complete number of abominations is 7. The work regimen of the priestly calendar revolves around 7. I could go on and on, and even that is not exhausting. Yeah. The really important ones, though, have to do with temple construction and dedication, as I already alluded to, and Walton has done the best work in the modern period for making this kind of accessible, of understanding how Genesis sort of points to a construction of creation as a temple for Yahweh to inhabit. But anyway, so how do you tell an account of creation? Well, you need to involve the issues that are of concern to the ancients. You need to sort of discount the other creation accounts, and so you got to use that language of the other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts to discount them. You construct it with a framework of 7, and I already alluded to the fact that the first 3 days are the framework. First day separates light and darkness. Second day, the waters above, the waters below. Third day, the earth emerges in the vegetation. Fourth day, the things that fill this, the luminaries get constructed that creates the light. The fifth day, what do you get? The birds of the heavens, fish of the sea, because the heavens and and the waters on the earth were separated. So you get the fullness of those things on the 5th day. The 6th day, you get the fullness of land with the animals and humans. So form and fullness are of concern, not some chronology of how Earth history unfolded.
Yeah.
So this is back to what assumptions is the text implicating versus what is just sort of left in the background, maybe implicit, but not of concern for the text at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we could ask the question: is it possible some ancient Israelites would have read these as 6 or 7 actual 24-hour days? Yeah, maybe.
They might have.
But at the I actually suspect that a lot of the original audience would have would have read the symbolism much more clearly than later readers. I think in this is one instance where I think you went from people that got the symbolism and the connections to people becoming much more rigid with this and trying to answer different questions based on a text that wasn't designed to answer those questions.
Well, Max, I think that I agree with you that it's that a reading of the 6 days plus the one in a 24-hour period, they are 24-hour days. I mean, the
Sure.
text says
Yeah,
morning and
it's
evening. I
talking
mean,
about days. Yeah, of
yeah,
course.
it's cast in terms of literary form. It's cast in a framework of a 6 day week, a work week, because it's setting the pattern for Sabbath. But there are what relevance theorists might call a speed bump in the communication, so that the sun being created after the light is just come back to an example again, or the vegetation being created before the sun when they knew that the vegetation depended on the sun. Those are what we would call speed bumps that would lead even an ancient reader, as it did the early church, early rabbis in the early church, to take the text as something other than a literal, straightforward reading. They knew that this was going in a different direction because there were details in the text that were, again, you'd have to read against the grain, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, to get that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's good. What do you make of the distinction then between Genesis 1 and then we pick up in the other creation account in the day when God created, the heavens and
Yeah.
earth, and we get a different.
Oops, not my. A couple of things about that is there are literary similarities between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 that also help us to read these texts in sort of a non sort of straightforward fashion. First of all, Genesis 1:1 is most likely just a summary heading to the whole creation account. Other creation accounts also, they have what's called the incipit. The first sentence
Mm-hmm.
introduces the account, and then the account begins after the first sentence. So you have, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, full stop. And then there's, in Hebrew, there's this disjunct grammatically, where a series of conditions are set up. The earth's formless and void, and waters over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the water. So there's these three conditions, and then the first act of creation, God creates light. Go to Genesis 2. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth on the day when God created the earth and the heavens. That's the sort of the summary introduction, and it uses, the author there uses the formula. These are the generations. In Hebrew, it's the Toledot.
Mm-hmm.
That's the formula that's used throughout the rest of the book of Genesis to introduce a new literary unit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next thing, coming after that, then you get that there's no shrub or bush in the field, or water and no water on the earth to water them, for God had not yet caused it to rain, and He had not created anyone to cultivate yet. So I didn't set up the literary, in the Hebrew text. The literary structure is the same. There are three components that are there. Where there are three conditions, then, out of which God begins the creation when He, forms the man out of the dust of the earth. So you have summary title, three conditions that God's beginning creation with, and then the creation account begins. So you have these two parallel accounts. But the second one focuses in on the sixth day with the creation of the man. And in fact, it helps solve the problem of how is it that the animals are created, after the man in Genesis chapter 2, but in Genesis 1, the animals are created before the man. Well, the texts aren't trying to give you the sequence.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't have to resort like the NIV does, that now, God had brought forth out of the ground. Look at your other translations. It's then God brought forth. And the Hebrew text is pretty clear. This is not a clause that goes back to the time before. So it's as though the lens changes from this big view of time and space, or outside of time and space in Genesis 1, to a focus now inside time and space with Genesis chapter 2. You get a chronological marker, Genesis 2:4, that tells you you're in history. These are the generations. You've got then also a geographical marker where the narrator describes this place of Eden to the east and the rivers that everyone recognizes and identifies, even though we aren't sure about the location of two of them anymore, which might be an indication that things are not, all that they might appear to be. But you're located with the Tigris and the Euphrates River.
Mm-hmm.
So Genesis 2, then, we've entered into the sequence of events where is one of the reasons I take it that Adam is a real person, maybe not the only one around at the time. We could talk about that, but he's a real person who exists because we are now inside time and space, whereas Genesis chapter 1, time and space haven't even begun yet. It's a theological introduction to the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
right.
I don't know if that answered your question
That's
or not.
great. No, yeah, I think that's really helpful for people to just kind of see those things together. Yeah, maybe that's the last thing we can talk about with Genesis before we kind of wrap up. So the question of Adam as a historical person and the relationship between that and evolutionary science, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I mean, even with the Genesis 2 and 3, I would agree with you that we have reporting in kind of more historical time in a sense, and yet this is still, it doesn't strike me as being in the realm of historiography in the same way that we have in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, nor do I think it was understood that way necessarily by early Jews. I mean, why do you have the Garden of Eden being compared to like the temple in Jubilees, and Adam and Eve are created outside of the garden and they have to go through a period of purification before they can come into this garden? And then in other texts, you have the garden is in one of the levels of heaven. It's being kept there. So it's almost like it's in a different realm in some way.
Yeah, the primordial. And if you read Ezekiel 20, Ezekiel 28, I mean, Ezekiel's understanding this as a sort of this primordial cosmic kind of garden situation.
Yeah. I think that's their drawing on Ezekiel.
Yeah. Ezekiel's not seeing Genesis 2 as quite as simply straightforward as we might think of it.
So we come to the question then of the nature of, the first parents, Adam and Eve, the first humans. Obviously, we have the issue again, another speed bump, as it were. We get to Genesis 4, and Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel. One son kills the other son. That's like the first sin of the Bible, really, the first act that's called sin. And Cain has a problem. He's going to be cast out, and the concern is that he's going to be treated poorly by the other inhabitants of the world. So God puts a mark on him, which raises a really interesting question. Were Adam and Eve just very active off of the scene here?
Someone would try to argue that that's what had to have happened.
They had Cain and Abel, but they were mass producing on the side. Or there's just more going on than meets the eye here, that we have a world full of human beings and Adam and Eve are there. So, and then we of course have the New Testament language of, all coming through Adam and his sin being kind of like the representative of all. I'm thinking of Romans 5. And so some people feel like, well, if you don't have a historical Adam, or you don't have an Adam who is, the one through whom all people come, then the whole Christian faith falls apart. So I'd be interested
Yeah.
to just kind of hear your talk on that, because I think that's another place where the whole science conversation goes. Is it's not just about Genesis for people. I mean, it is for some people; they just can't get over the literal 7 days. But for other people, it's also the whole Christian paradigm of salvation they think falls apart if
Yeah.
you start monkeying with their understanding of two people, Adamson, it kind of all falls on that. So what do you say to that?
The historical Adam questions is really the sticky wicket. Actually, the more difficult theological issue behind that uh, is, and it's what I think we have to be careful to protect theologically, is an event, the eventness of the fall. That's I think people don't care so much about a historical Adam if they can preserve an explanation for the human condition under sin.
Okay.
And you know, you lose the problem of representation in Christ with respect to being the second Adam. But federal with federal headship, you can have your cake and eat it too by positing, as Derek Kidner did back in the 60s, uh, a, a, a small human population with a king and a queen that the Bible calls Adam and Eve. And through federal representation, you can accomplish um, the Christological concern theologically that way. And in fact, just to throw this out, I don't have time to go into it, and I'm not the one to do it anyway because it's deeply embedded in the science of genetics. But it is well accepted now that not only do we have, or can we have, one biological parent for every we meaning every person alive on the planet today would have one biological set of parents. It is statistical, almost fact, in terms of probability is so high that there are many pairs in our past, uh, genealogical past, whose DNA is in every human on the planet today.
Mm.
It only takes 3,000 years for uh, for one human pair to have their genes spread in every progeny that's alive on the planet. It's work done by a scientist at Washington University in St. Louis. He's head of a major genetic, I can't remember, it's population, what's it called, the term, scientific term. Um, uh, yeah, it's doing massive computer modeling of human populations and genes and things. Anyway, um, and he's a believer, evangelical, but his work has been peer reviewed in non-Christian journals. And it is, like I said, it's likely now that we have many individuals in the past whose gene chromosomes are in every one of us on the planet alive today, and probably many, if for sure, one pair and many pairs. So you can statistically, there doesn't have to be this sort of bottleneck that some people have posited in the past, where you've got this big human population, then it whittles down to one human pair, Adam and Eve, and then it spreads out again. There are those hourglasses are everywhere, and so you can have your cake and eat it too in terms of a historical Adam and Eve, as well as comply with the current realities of genetic science and population statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just throwing that out there
Yeah.
for to tantalize the curiosity of your audience.
Yeah.
On this question of the historical Adam and Eve, I personally still think that having a historical Adam and Eve makes the best sense of all the data biblically, theologically, and at the same time I think that science pushes us statistically to having others around alive at the time of this, this Adam and Eve. And the biblical text, as we've talked about, hints in that direction.
Genesis 4.
Yeah, as well. There are, well, better than I do, Max. There are ways of reading Romans 5. Romans 5 is really the text that's the most difficult.
Yeah.
There are ways of reading that text that are still faithful theologically. They're, I think, difficult, but I think the holding to a historical Adam model of some kind still complies best with the exegetical and theological material, and it doesn't ruffle the scientific feathers at all either.
What about so we could have a scenario where you have a kind of representative couple, let's say, that God chooses out of whatever population is there, and that is Adam and Eve, who we have as who fall or whatever, or commit the first act of disobedience. It's credited in that way, and that's something that's a lot of people have suggested now. One of the trickier ones is the way that death is sort of baked into the system. Death and decay. What do you do? What do you do with that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's why I was careful to say that it's really the quote unquote the eventness of sin entering the world. So for humans, you could make a plausible case, and many evangelicals hold this. Jack Collins, who's, he's on the spectrum of things. He's just a little bit to the conservative side of me on it. I still carry an inerrancy card in my wallet. Well, not literally, but I'm a member of the Evangelical Theological Society. But even someone like Jack Collins, who's a good Reformed theologian, argues that death in Genesis 3 pertains more to the question of spiritual death. Exegetically, I think the best case is, science completely aside, that Adam and Eve were only conditionally immortal.
You need the tree. They needed access to the tree.
Yeah, yes, because the way God actualizes the dying process for them is to cut them off from the tree. That only makes sense if access to the tree is what maintains their immortality. And that view was held by early Irenaeus. I mean, early church fathers held to this kind of model as well. So the human death question is not difficult at all. Animal death is more difficult, but there are many, including Calvin, who had no problem with animal death before the fall of Adam and Eve. So the difficult question, the more theologically important question, is human death. That's not difficult to solve, as I just mentioned. The more difficult question is animal death in deep time, and the amount of animals that have had to die in this process that we call evolution to bring about what we have today. That's a very difficult ethical question that I don't have a good answer for. It's mitigated by some things like, do animals really understand death? In other words, the consciousness, understanding what's happening to you, and even the experience, what it means to experience pain. Pain is not as problematic as understanding what pain is, and we as humans understand what pain is. And so, Max, if you step on my toe, that's not as problematic as you stomping on my foot, because in the latter, I know that there's an intentionality there. I have an understanding about it that creates problems relationally and psychologically that are more difficult. A person who is severely injured in an accident has a different experience than someone who suffers as a victim of a violent, intentional assault.
Sure.
So there are these questions of psychology that need to be played into this nature red with tooth and claw question. So that's one mitigating issue. The other one is eschatological, and I'm inclined this way that Christ's redemption is cosmic. The atonement is not just to get my carcass into this wispy place called heaven. That's a wrong view of the atonement. The atonement is very tangible. It pertains to the physical, all of the physical creation, to procure the restoration and the cleansing of the physical creation. And I think that extends then, I think, easily to the animal kingdom. And you have Psalm 36 that said God saves humans and animals. The vision of Isaiah 11, if depending on how you want to read the imagery there. I do hold to a view of the eschaton, the new creation, the new heavens and new earth, that is inhabited by animals. And some argue that, in fact, the planet is big enough. Every human being that ever existed on the planet can fit on the island of Wight. I heard N.T. Wright say that once on Jon Stewart. No, not Jon Stewart. It was Colbert.
Was it Stephen Colbert? Yeah, that's right.
Stephen Colbert.
He was on Stephen Colbert.
Yeah, it was really a good episode. Colbert tried to get the better of him, but he didn't. Wright's too sharp for that. So it's not difficult to imagine that animals that matter, in other words, animals that could have some sentience to them, like higher mammals, for example, for them to be resurrected as such is not theologically problematic, and maybe to be expected. So there could be a redemption of the animals who have suffered in deep time, the ones that, again, like I said, the ones that matter, not fish and reptiles that have no sense of what's going on. So some combination of that could help us as we wrestle through the problem of animal suffering in deep time. But that's a topic big and difficult enough for a whole presentation.
Yeah,
at
sure.
some point.
So. Yeah, no, I was just curious because I wondered if anybody would be thinking about that question.
Yeah, so a lot of scholars are. Yeah, I'll leave it there. We could go on and on.
No, that's good. That's good. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I guess maybe where we could leave people with is just if you had any thoughts for words of wisdom, I guess, for approaching this question and question of Bible and science or other big issues like this. I think for me, the one thing that I kind of keep coming back to with people, well, it's a couple things. One is, I'm a Bible guy, and so I want to help people read the Bible better. And so regardless of the issue, my number one objective isn't to harmonize the Bible with science. It's to ask the question of what's the Bible trying to do in the first place. And so that's part one. So I think it's always, when we run up into these interesting, complicated issues, it just provides a really nice opportunity for us to go back to the biblical text and think deeply about what Scripture is doing. And I don't want us to miss it, because the opening of the story is really important to the rest of the story. And if we get caught up on, building creation museums in the middle of the country and developing our life around that, like, we're really going to miss the boat here. And and then the other part is just the very realistic missional component of this. I know people, and it's just a tragedy anytime you hear stories of people leaving the Christian faith, or their primary objection to the Christian faith being that it's a kind of backward, anti-scientific movement. And I'm very concerned about that. That doesn't make me feel like I have to harmonize my faith with every aspect of science. It's not like I check in each day with the scientific community to say, is it okay if I believe this now, or something like that? But I don't think there's any virtue in creating unnecessary obstacles to the faith. And when we have good answers, I think we should provide them. Like, I think every age of the church has a responsibility to engage with the information that we have from all disciplines, from all ways of knowing, including, right, science. And so, we should be thinking about, what do we know from science, and how do we, I don't know if reconcile is the right word, but how do we set that in right conversation with what we have in
Yeah.
Scripture? So
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
where I'm
So,
coming
yeah.
from.
So Augustine is saying, look, the earth is round, not flat. Get over it and move on.
Yeah. Yeah, and can we learn from mistakes we've made in the past? Like
Yeah.
maybe expelling people from the church because they insisted that the earth was revolving around the sun rather than vice versa.
Or,
Like,
but yeah. Yeah.
oh, sorry, rather that the sun was
Yeah.
revolving around
The
the earth.
opposite.
Right. Yeah, they
Yes.
were convinced that the earth was the stable thing and everything
Yeah.
revolved around the earth because after all, we're the apple of God's eye, we're so important. And we've got metaphorical language in the Bible of the sun rising and setting or staying in the sky. So it's not like it's not like we're at a place where this is the first time where Christians have debated how to handle certain biblical text in light of science, but maybe we can learn some lessons from the past of places where that wasn't handled so well by
Mm-hmm.
Christians and improve on that. Yeah. So yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. My personal biography, it started out and I was on neutral ground. I could have gone either direction, young earth or old earth. They were both viable, acceptable options for a young 18-year-old Christian. Um, I got pressed by the scientific data early on in my geology program uh, that just couldn't fit with a flood model and that could be a whole nother, you know, broadcast present or podcast. But I also, as I got into seminary and started reading, you know, scholars reading the text differently in ways that didn't uh, that didn't pinch on or didn't allow the science to pinch on it. That was helpful. One of the other liberating questions for me was looking at ancient Near Eastern texts when I began to read them and see what kind of genre, what type of literature Genesis 1 is and what it's trying to do. That was a very liberating movement. And then, of course, I mentioned the break of not feeling like I had to read it in a concordant fashion at all. So those were steps that I sort of went through. I think the first question that someone has to ask is sort of this decision tree, and I think I've sent you this, my slides on this, but you got to decide: are you just sold on a young Earth reading of Genesis 1? If you are, then end of conversation. But if you're not in that is one. I mean, you could read the text that way. I mean,
People do.
it's people do. It's not stupid to read Genesis 1 as a straightforward 24-hour day creation. Uh, you can do that if you are open to other um, alternatives. Then you have to look at nature and not just reading Genesis, but you got to read nature. And when you read nature, you may decide, well, yeah, nature says young Earth. I think that's extremely difficult, personally. We can go on multiple lines of independent argumentation that all converge at the same place against a young Earth. Um, and reading the text creates a problem for straightforward reading as well. So you could read nature and decide it's young Earth and you're back to young Earth again. Or if you read nature, then you're going to end up with an old Earth. And then you got to decide, okay, we've got an old Earth, and that's where I had come to, but I realized that old Earth doesn't mean necessarily a certain model of evolution. So you still have the evolution question. How do you read it? One thing's clear with an old Earth is that life forms have changed over time. So if that's what you mean by evolution, then well, duh, you can see it easy, plain enough. The question is, what's the mechanism? And so back to then you go with what's called a evolutionary creationism, which says that God, that's it used to be called theistic evolution. Now the term that's more used is evolutionary creationism, because adherents to that want to make sure we understand that they're creationists in a sense. They believe that
Okay.
God is ultimately responsible. So in evolutionary creationism, God is at work providentially at every, at all steps of the way. He's superintending all the processes. And that's the position that, faithful, Bible believing Christians have held for, ever since the 18th century, um, when the notion of evolution began to be formulated. Or you have an old Earth creationism that says that, okay, we've got changing forms over history, which is hard to deny, but the mechanism is more, God making creative moves, where there's a common design, but God is intervening to create this diversity of forms that we
And
you
that's
know that
important.
we
That's
see
important to
today.
people. So some people will say, I believe in microevolution, not
Not
macroevolution.
right, exactly.
And what they're trying to guard there is any sort of
Yeah,
species evolution. So it stays within that
yeah,
particular species group. And they seem to be okay with that. It's just any change from one to another.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some smart people. The reason to believe, apologetic group is, very much still holding out for, for a um, old Earth creationism kind of model, and I would be roadkill in that debate with people, because biology and, evolutionary biology wasn't my area. I can hold my own on age of the Earth, but I'll get out of the way of the other conversation. If you want to know where I am personally, I'm inclined to, I'm happy with let's just say I've got a robust view of providence, and so I'm not uncomfortable with God um, superintending the processes that are involved. And I think it's been well established for 150 years that theologically that fits very comfortably within an evangelical uh, doctrine of creation, and that's where I've landed. But I respect people who there are some problems still with the neo-Darwinian synthesis, uh, and an honest evolutionary biologist will say that. But
Sure.
do you chuck the whole model?
Right.
Is the problem sufficient enough to get you to chuck the whole model?
Right.
And that's back to how we change. The question that you asked early on in our conversation. I think we change when we are convinced of some evidence that makes our former position uh, uh, not workable or not cohesive anymore, and so
Mm-hmm.
we modify our model.
Yeah.
That's change.
Yeah. And it's totally okay to do that with your faith, like when you're your interpretation. Like I know we live in a day and age where people are very concerned with deconstruction and like,
Yeah,
changing your belief, because that involves some sort of slippery slope away. But what we're trying to suggest here is we're just trying to provide resources for people who want to be faithful Christians and think about their faith in light of what scripture teaches and in light of what science teaches, and just say, hey, there's a variety of ways you can go about this, but you don't need to go about it in fear, feeling
yeah,
like at every point in John's decision tree, if you take the wrong fork in the tree, you've gone down to, Satan's path or something like that. Like
yeah, yeah,
there's a variety of ways to think about this, and it's complex. And so I'll be the first to say I'm very open minded on a lot of things, and constantly interested and open to new evidence and you know, thinking about things differently. But part of what gives me confidence to do that is, uh, I've done the work, at least, as far as as much as I can do. I've looked into these biblical texts, how they've been interpreted, what they're doing in their context, and that performs a really essential role in giving me kind of some parameters then to think about faithfully carrying forward the tradition
mm-hmm.
in terms of where we fit. So yeah, I hope this was
Yeah,
helpful. Hope this was helpful to people. And we can definitely have, if there's more demand, we can have more of these kind of conversations. I know it's a big question for a lot of people, and it's a struggle to kind of think through. But I guess the last thing I just want to again highlight is that it's not a conversation you have to enter with a posture of fear. You can enter it with
Okay.
a posture of faith-seeking understanding, openness, humility. And you may watch this and say, I'm still, at the end of the day, I don't really care what you say. I'm still convinced that it's, young earth, and that's where I land. That's fine. I hope you still got something out of this, and hope it, at the very least, it might help you understand why others feel differently and how you might engage somebody who's asking questions about the Christian faith, and that's the science thing is a major obstacle. So, yeah, I think it's a good place for us to end. Anything else, John? You think you
No,
want to
no,
say?
it's been thanks again, Max. We've opened up a huge can of a lot of worms here, and I hope I haven't rambled off too far into the rabbit trails because there's this, like you said, this is really complicated, and there are lots of pieces to put together in this, and
Yeah.
we didn't put them all together,
No.
so we just got to be happy with that.
We opened up the can, and now there's some worms
Yeah,
crawling all over the place. But that's okay. You got to open up the can and start somewhere. So
yeah,
again,
yeah,
hopefully this was
indeed.
helpful to people. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you want round 2 or round 3. I'm always game for that. I'm pretty sure John is too. So
Yep, you bet.
all right, thanks, John.
Yep, thanks, Max. Bye.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.